The town may be begun by laying out 2 capital streets 50 feet wide. In this description of the process of laying out the town of Kenmare in County Kerry, William Petty Fitzmaurice reduced the essence of the town to just 2 principal streets of determined dimension. The street is the coalescing element in a system of plots, buildings and blocks that constitute urban grain. In her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs argued for a re-evaluation of city streets as a place where the familiar had the potential to collide with the unexpected. But whereas in a city, streets are by definition full of strangers, in a rural town, the street tends to act as a slowly moving public space in which familiar faces engage outside, within, and between the street and the shop. It could be argued that one of the specific values of the street in a rural town is to accommodate the collision of the expected in a culture where, due to its dispersed agricultural hinterland, social engagement demands to be more actively fostered than in the city. This paper is going to explore the form of the street in the Irish rural town. Analysis of 14 streets surveyed in Bandon, County Cork, Longford Town, Westport in Mayo and New Ross in Wexford will be used to illustrate themes of proportion, containment, inhabitation threshold and the relationship between the car and the pedestrian. And that's just before lunch. The rural town street can be seen historically as a theatre for temporal activity, reflective of its productive landscape and its rhythms and rituals. How this relationship has changed and continues to evolve will be discussed. The extent to which the rural town street is seen as a desirable place to live will be explored through an examination of housing typology in rural towns. Can the street maintain its integrity when the space above its ground floor becomes vacant? Is this scenario an indicator of the forthcoming obsolescence of the street, or can it be seen as an opportunity to offer an alternative housing model to the suburban deluge that flooded across the landscape, particularly between the mid-90s and 2008? Firstly, let's look a little bit more closely at Petty's statement. He emphasises the need for 2 streets, not just of a particular width, but also of a specified character. He says they should be capital, by which in this context we might assume to mean distinct from the other streets of the town. The rural town comprises a hierarchy of street typologies, from the small-scale street, which may be primarily residential in function, to secondary streets, which can accommodate a mixture of use, including shops, commercial offices and dwelling, to the main or capital streets, which are the foundation points of Petty's town design theory. In this context, Main Street connotes a singular street above others, but Petty points out that a single main street on its own is not enough in itself to begin a town. If we take the example of Kenmare or of Westport, both planned towns laid out in the late 18th century, the street was linked in its layout to formal public spaces, the triangle in the case of Kenmare and the octagon and mall in the case of Westport. This was a new method of rural town planning in Ireland, joining the space of the street with that of public space, which did not automatically equate public space with market space. Prior to these estate towns, most Gaelic, Anglo-Norman and plantation towns were characterised by a single predominant main street, which often widened to one end in its accommodation of temporary markets or fairs. The main street in Longford, a Gaelic market town, is an example of this type. Its long, wide main street is of a distinct spatial order compared to the other streets in the town. Petty specified a width of 50 feet for his capital streets. That's 15.25 metres. In a survey of main streets in the 4 study towns that I looked at, the range of street widths varied from 9.2 to 47 metres, but the average width is approximately 15 metres. Bear in mind that this width was recommended and constructed long before the invention of the car. The design dimension accommodated horse-drawn carts, carriages and coaches, but it's argued here that it was also a function of sectional spatial design. Looking more closely at the surveyed sections, Petty's specified dimension is most closely matched by Bridge Street in Westport. The height of this street is on average 9.2 metres. The proportion of the street matches those of the golden section ratio of 1:1.6. The other surveyed streets that match this ratio include Dublin Road in Longford and South Street in New Ross. These streets, although in very different towns, one Anglo-Norman, one Gaelic and one planned estate town, they all feel like good streets, good places to be, adequately enclosed with an easy connection from one side of the street to the other, passively engaged by the edges at ground and upper floors. In the case of streets whose height exceeds this ratio, such as South Street and Bandon, the resultant streets are dark. The upper stories appear to dominate the space of the pavements below. And on streets whose section is wider, for example Main Street in Longford, the space of the sky leaks, the street lacks enclosure, a spatial distinction of the street as a public space. As a result, pedestrians on either side of the street are disconnected from one another. The facing edges of the street are too distant from one another to allow easy visual connection from shop to shop. Another defining characteristic is the amount of ground space of the street allocated to the pedestrian in comparison to the car. When the amount of ground given to the car exceeds a ratio of about 1:1.5, the car becomes the dominant user of the street and the pedestrian has to yield as a secondary user. All of the streets surveyed in Longford are car dominant, and it only takes a few minutes in the town to realise this. Car users are so confident of their primacy that cars are routinely abandoned with hazard lights flashing as shoppers double park outside their destination, regardless of how other street users have to manoeuvre around them. By contrast, South Main Street in Bandon, Bridge Street in Westport and South Street in New Ross have ratios of car to pavement use closer to 1:1.5. Because of wider pavements, narrower and more clearly defined carriageways, controlled parking and dedicated crossing points at the same level as pavements, cars have to move more slowly, more carefully and thus more quietly, giving pedestrians the perception that they are the primary street users and therefore able to meander, to have a conversation and to crisscross the street easily between shops. It's simple stuff really, but it's the difference between a street that stays alive, vibrant and occupied, and one that is less attractive to use as a pedestrian, because once we're in our cars, it's as easy to visit the out-of-town shopping centre and bypass the street altogether. The traditional role of the main street as the primary place of the market and of the town dweller has shifted from the centre, as shown in this slide of pre-1960 markets in Longford, to the edge and online. Larger retailers with off-street car parking offer more choice and ease of access to the consumer, who, due to the increase in suburban and one-off housing, now drives to work, school drop-offs and shop. The main street, despite its variety of function and choice of produce, finds it hard to compete with this generic retail machine at ground floor, and its space above this level is no longer perceived as an attractive place to live. A survey of occupancy and vacancy of the main streets in the four towns, at both ground and upper floor levels, shows how much variety and choice is contained within the space of the street. But it also reveals that on average 40% of the space of the street is vacant. So these are the main streets of the four towns with all of the use, whether it's occupied or not, on ground and upper floor levels indicated. And this is the vacancy mapped on elevations of the four streets. It's worth considering what's likely to be lost if this trend towards vacation of the space of the street continues. Because the town street is much more than a haphazard collection of shops with the occasional dwelling above. In a way which is singular to rural towns, it is the space where the cyclical character of rural life is accommodated and made visible, often in quiet and yet direct ways, a couple of which I will quickly describe. In towns in the west of Ireland, on the evening of the last night of April, spring flowers are left on the thresholds of doorways. This custom is stunning in its delicacy. Flowers laid on the ground in the space between the public street and the private home are there for a few fleeting hours. They're almost invisible. There's no coming together on the 1st of May, it's not a religious holiday, there's nothing commercial attached to it, it's just a day when the community marks the fresh new season, the hope of springtime, and brings this into the space of the town and the street. On the Feast of Corpus Christi in June, new communicants make a procession through the town, scattering flowers gathered from gardens. To mark this day, shops will remove their usual wares from the windows and replace them with a display including a statue, flowers or coloured cloth. In this way, the public space of the street is projected into the space of the private shop. The street expands in section to become part theatre to the communal life of the town. The longest day of the year, June the 23rd, called St. John's Night or Bonfire Night, is marked by groups of families and friends coming together to light a fire, share some food and celebrate the light. This is a rural tradition, and you can see from fire to fire in the countryside, but it's also carried out in the town. Back gardens give off telltale clouds of smoke and laughter. Its marking registers the dependence of the town on the productive landscape around it. Death is also publicly acknowledged on the street. Funeral processions stop the traffic and transform the soundscape of the street to one of silence but for footsteps. Mourning bows on shops are public markers of respect for the dead. The purpose of these rituals is to bind those who live together in the knowledge of place and people and their stories. The characters who uphold the traditions are custodians of these stories. In Westport, Dominic Moran, shown here on the left, is the holder of the key to the clock at the top of Bridge Street. In a way, he minds the time and therefore the continuity of the main street, those who use it and those who live there. Unfortunately, Dominic is one of the last remaining residents who live on the street. What the future holds for the street isn't clear, but there's little doubt that its current state of decline will continue unless it is once again made attractive as a place to live and work. Without a new population to continue and evolve tradition, to add new stories and remember the old ones, the rural town main street will be further vacated. So where did everybody go? In the last 15 years, there's been a fundamental shift in where and how town dwellers live. This change applies to rural towns in a way that has not occurred in cities. There's been a significant shift from dwelling in the centre of towns to one-off houses and new suburbs on the outskirts. Overzoning of agricultural land for residential use outside of towns, lax planning of these new areas, poor government policy and easily available finance facilitated conditions in which over 500,000 new houses were built in Ireland between 1997 and 2006. Today, almost 300,000 of these houses are still vacant.